Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Tzadi Dalid is primarily about what happens when a wall of a chutzner falls down on Shabbos. A number of halachas relevant to that. The main issue is obviously when Shabbos begins, you have a certain halacha. If something about the status changes, does that status change or not? Do you stick with the halacha that was relevant when Shabbos began, or do you change it based on the situation? Now we're going to have two mishnayos. From the beginning of the daf till the first mishnah is discussing what happens if you have two chaseros near each other, they're adjoining, and they did not make an eruv together because they're separated by a wall, and then that wall fell down. Now the two chaseros are open to each other. So Rav says now they become aser. Rav holds that the fact that they were mutter separately at the beginning of Shabbos and they did not have to join an eruv chatzeros with each other, that you were allowed to carry in each of them, doesn't help you now. Now they are open to each other. It's forbidden to carry from one to the other, and therefore it's forbidden to carry even within one, because the halacha is that any chatzer, any area which is open to another area that you're not allowed to carry into. So even this area itself is usher to carry, and Gzera you may come to carry from this area to the other one. Okay, so Rav therefore holds you're only allowed to carry within 4 amas. Now Shmuel disagrees, and Shmuel says no. Since it was mutter in the beginning of Shabbos, it remains mutter the rest of Shabbos, and therefore it's not a problem that you can't carry into the neighboring chutzner. You're still allowed to carry in this entire chutzner up until the place where the wall used to be. Now there's also another machlokes adjoining this, which Rashi points out, and that's what about the halacha? They both paskin like Rabbi Shimon that you're allowed to carry from chutzner to chutzner, even without an eruv chatzeros. So what's the problem here? So Rav additionally holds you're only allowed to carry from chutzner to chutzner when there is no eruv chatzeros between a chutzner and its house. And here we're talking about where there is an eruv chatzeros between the chutzner and the house. That's why there's a problem. And Shmuel doesn't hold to that. Shmuel says you're allowed to carry even if there is an eruv chatzeros, and therefore you're allowed to carry things which started in the house, things which are in the chutzner. You're allowed to carry objects from the chutzner to the other chutzner, and even objects which you're not allowed to carry which the other chutzner to the other chutzner because they started Shabbos in the house. You're still allowed to carry it in this entire chutzner. You don't need to worry about the fact that the wall fell down. Now the Gemara says this halacha which we're saying in the name of Rav never said straight out. We learned it from an incident. We can also see Shmuel's shita from this incident, but the Gemara just discusses Rav. The story was that Rav and Shmuel were sitting in a chutzner on Shabbos afternoon, and boom, the wall fell down. So says Shmuel, take this cloth and hang it up where the wall used to be. So that would involve carrying. So Rav turned his face away, didn't want to look. So Shmuel said, Rav doesn't look like Rav holds of this, but we're going to force him. So hang up the sheet, use the belt that he's wearing to hold it up. It was a joke of sorts, the Mefarshim explain. Okay, so the Gemara asks a few things about this story. This is funny in many ways. What we do see from here that Shmuel allows you to carry within this chutzner, even though the wall fell down, and Rav does not. So the Gemara says, first of all, what's the point in hanging up the sheet? If you're allowed to carry, why do we need the sheet? The Gemara says the sheet was not a halachic thing, the sheet was for privacy. The Gemara says, okay, well, if Rav held it was usher, why didn't he say so? So Gemara says he couldn't say so because it was Shmuel's city, it was his area, and Rav did not have rights to override his psak. Gemara says, well then why did he turn away his face? He's not allowed to argue on Shmuel, so he's agreeing with Shmuel here, and therefore he shouldn't turn away his face. Gemara said he didn't want people to think that he agreed halachically. Here he was going to submit to Shmuel's psak, but he wanted to be clear that as far as his own shita, that's not what he holds. Okay, we're now in the next Mishnah, and here we're discussing what happens when the wall of a chutzner falls down, and it is now open to a reshus harabim. So the chutzner is now exposed to reshus harabim because the wall fell down. So the question is, what is the halacha of this chutzner? So it's a machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. Rabbi Eliezer says it becomes like a reshus harabim, and therefore if you were to carry from another reshus yachid into this chutzner, it would be an isur deraisa, and same thing vice versa. Now the Chachamim say it's not a reshus harabim. It's still a chutzner, even though it's open to reshus harabim. It has the halacha of a karmelis. You're not allowed to carry from it into reshus harabim or a reshus yachid, but it's not an isur deraisa. It's only an isur derabanan. So the Gemara discusses this. The Gemara says, first of all, Rabbi Eliezer holds just because it's open to reshus harabim and the rabim, the public can walk around in there, that makes it into reshus harabim. It's a chutzner still, it belongs to somebody. So Gemara says yes. Rabbi Eliezer holds that if the rabbim use an area, it becomes a Rishos HaRabbim. And you see that halacha in a brisa discussing something else. Rabbi Eliezer says, if the rabbim decide to create a road for themselves through somebody's field, it belongs to them. The rabbim have rights. If they walk through somebody's yard, it belongs to them, and it becomes a rabbim. And therefore here also, because it's open, they're walking through it, and therefore it becomes a Rishos HaRabbim. Gemara says, hold on a second, but Rav Gidl said in the name of Rav that halacha, Rabbi Eliezer says that the rabbim have rights to create a road for themselves. That's only if we already know that there was a road there. We just don't know where exactly. So the rabbim say it was here, and the owner says no, it was there. So the rabbim have a right to choose. Wherever they make their road, that's the final. But they can't just make themselves a road where there wasn't one. So here also in this chutzner, they can't just make it into a Rishos HaRabbim where it wasn't one before. So the Gemara says, maybe you'll tell me that there was a road here before. It was open to the rabbim. So how could that be? So the question is, where was the wall? Meaning the wall fell down, and the argument about the argument between the rabbim and the homeowner is where was the wall? The rabbim say it was deeper in, and therefore greater space belongs to the rabbim and have a right to walk there. The homeowner says no, it was further out. What does Rabbi Eliezer say? What does he mean when he says that it's a Rishos HaRabbim, and if you carry there from a Rishos HaYachid, you're violating the Nisa D'Oraisa? It's referring to the place that's under dispute. The edge where the wall used to be, the disputed zone, the space between the rabbim's idea of where the wall was and the homeowner's idea of where the wall was. That's all that they're referring to. The Gemara says, you want to say that, so you have a problem, because the language of the Mishnah is that they're allowed to carry up until the wall. That seems to imply, or that it's a Rishos HaRabbim. It doesn't say they're allowed to. They're not allowed to. Up until the wall. It seems to imply that the entire chutzner is now a Rishos HaRabbim, not just a piece near where the disputed area of where the wall used to be. So the Gemara says, okay, maybe I'll tell you, just change the wording. Instead of ad ha-mechitza, the entire area up until the mechitza, it should read al ha-mechitza. They're arguing about the area of where the mechitza was, and that's what the dispute is, and that's the area that becomes a Rishos HaRabbim because the rabbim are using it. Now the Gemara says, I'll give you another answer to explain why Rabbi Eliezer holds this. We're not discussing a regular chutzner that was open. We're discussing a chutzner which is right on the sides of a major Rishos HaRabbim, and the Rishos HaRabbim use it as a tzidei Rishos HaRabbim. Right? We have sidewalks in our days, but sidewalks are a real Rishos HaRabbim. In the days of Chazal, there was Rishos HaRabbim where everybody walked, and then there was tzidei. There were certain obstacles and walls and fences of some sort that were set up, that the rabbim were able to go in there and use it, but it wasn't used in a major way. It was used for people to stop and rest, and it had some access to the public in the thoroughfare, but it wasn't really part of the thoroughfare. And that's what their machlokes is about. So this chutzner is now a tzidei Rishos HaRabbim. Rabbi Eliezer holds a tzidei Rishos HaRabbim, this side zone, that counts as Rishos HaRabbim, and the Chachamim hold it does not. So the Gemara says, if that's the machlokes, so why are we talking about a chutzner where the wall fell down? Talk about a regular tzidei Rishos HaRabbim. So the Gemara says, because if we were talking about tzidei Rishos HaRabbim, I would think it's only because of those obstacles that are set up that the Chachamim say it doesn't count as a tzidei, that it doesn't count as a real Rishos HaRabbim. If, however, you had a situation in which there were no obstacles, then they would agree that it is part of Rishos HaRabbim. Well, here you have a case where there's no obstacles. The wall of the chutzner is gone. It disappeared. The obstacles are gone. And that's why we need to say that this is a case where the Chachamim still argue on Rabbi Eliezer, and they say that it does not count as Rishos HaRabbim, and you aren't allowed to consider it Rishos HaRabbim. If you carry from there to a Rishos HaYachid, it will only be an Iser D'Rabbanan. So now the Gemara says, but hold on a second. This explanation seems to indicate that the only argument is about, again, the edge of the chutzner. That's the area that would be called tzidei Rishos HaRabbim. The rest of the chutzner would not. But if you look at the language of the Mishnah, it says somebody who carries from into it to a Rishos HaYachid, or from Rishos HaYachid into it, miteicha liteicha. That language implies deep in the chutzner is where they're arguing, not just on the edge of the chutzner. So how can you say that the only area where Rabbi Eliezer says that it becomes a Rishos HaRabbim is on the sides of the chutzner, the edge of the chutzner? It's not true. He seems to be referring to the entire chutzner. So the Gemara says, no, the only reason why he used the word miteicha is because that's the word that the Chachamim used, and the Chachamim were saying that the entire chutzner is a carmelis. So he also talked about the entire chutzner being a carmelis. The Gemara says, hold on a second, this doesn't make sense. The first opinion in the Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer. The Chachamim are responding to him. If he wasn't talking about the rest of the chutzner, why would they talk about the rest of the chutzner? So the Gemara says, what they're trying to say is as follows. They're trying to say Look, the rest of the chutzner you're agreeing to us as a Carmelist, right? This whole argument is about the edge, which is Tzidei Rishus Harabim. So the rest of it you're agreeing. So that's why they say Mi Teicha and Le Teicha. The rest of it you're agreeing is a Carmelist. So we're telling you, listen, the Tzidei Rishus Harabim should be just like the rest of the chutzner. It's also part of the chutzner to have the same halacha. Should also be a Carmelist. On that, Rabbi Eliezer argues because he says it's not true. The Tzidei Rishus Harabim, a lot of people walk around there. It's relatively close to Rishus Harabim, and people use it, as opposed to the rest of the chutzner where people do not use it. Therefore, you have to differentiate them into separate zones. Okay, we now begin the next Mishnah. This Mishnah is discussing also a wall of a chutzner which fell down and it's open, at least according to our Gersa, to Rishus Harabim. The issue in this Mishnah is not that. The issue in this Mishnah is when a wall falls down and changes the halacha, do we have a new halacha now if it fell down on Shabbos? Or do we say we stick with the halacha that was there in the beginning of a Shabbos? So it's a machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda says you go with the halacha of the beginning of a Shabbos and therefore it stays mutter. And Rabbi Yossi says no, it's got to be the same halacha now as it would be next Shabbos, and there you wouldn't have this beginning of a Shabbos stuff. So it becomes usher now from the moment that the wall falls down. So again, Rabbi Yehuda says you go with the halach in the beginning of Shabbos and it stays mutter, and Rabbi Yossi holds no, it becomes usher. Now the Mishnah had given 3 examples. What are the 3 examples? One is a chutzner which was open to Rishus Harabim on both sides, on 2 sides. The Gemara will primarily discuss why do you need 2 sides. Also a house that the wall fell down and now it's open to Rishus Harabim on 2 sides. That's the second example. And the third example is you have a mavoi that had a lechi or a kaira, a side post or a crossbeam, making it permitted to carry within it, and then that fell down. So the Gemara's question is, we have 2 things here. We had the example of a chutzner which was open on 2 sides to Rishus Harabim, and a house which is open on 2 sides to Rishus Harabim, both cases because the wall fell down. Why do I need 2 sides? One side should be enough. So the Gemara says, remember the halacha is that if you have a gap of 10 amos or less, that counts as a doorway, and it's still considered to be a closed wall. If you have a gap of more than 10 amos, it's considered to be open. So the Gemara says, what are we talking about over here? These gaps, these walls that fell down, you're leaving a gap of 10 amos or less? If that's the case, and it doesn't matter how many walls are down, even if both walls are down, it's problematic, because you shouldn't consider it to be open to Rishus Harabim. And if you're talking about where the gap is larger than 10 amos, then why do I need 2 gaps? Why do I need 2 walls to be down? It should be enough if only 1 wall is down. So the answer is going to be a machlokes Rav and Shmuel. According to Rav, the Mishnah is referring to where the opening is 10 amos or less. According to Shmuel, it's referring to where the opening is more than 10 amos. How does Rav understand it? So Rav says as follows: the opening is 10 amos or less, and therefore really it should be a doorway. But we're talking about where it's a corner. The gap is on the corner. There's a little piece of wall missing from 2 adjoining walls at their corner. Each piece, each wall that meets in a corner is missing a piece. So there's a diagonal gap now that's cut off. If you're standing in the house or the chutzner and you're looking towards the corner, you see a diagonal opening. Both pieces of wall are missing a piece from the corner outwards. So what's the halacha there? The halacha is that you cannot call it a doorway. Nobody makes a doorway in the corner of their property, in the corner of the house, or in the corner of their chutzner, and therefore, even though it's 10 amos or less, it doesn't count as a doorway. And there's really only one gap. That's what we mean when we say that it broke on 2 sides. We mean it broke in the corner and a little bit of both sides. And that's true for a chutzner, and that's true for a house. Now, in a house, though, you have to add halacha. In a house, there's a halacha called pi tikra yard v'saisim. Then the ceiling, the roof, counts as a wall. If that's the case, so then why doesn't the ceiling count as a wall here? So Rav explains, we're talking about where there's a slanted roof, and you don't say pitikra on a slanted roof. A ceiling doesn't count as a wall. On a slanted ceiling, it only counts as a wall on a straight ceiling. Okay, that's Rav's pshat. Now Shmuel says differently. Shmuel says we're talking about where the gap is larger than 10 amos. The gap is larger than 10 amos, okay. So why do I need 2 gaps? So Shmuel says in a chutzner you don't need 2 gaps. 1 gap is enough to make it aser and to change the halacha, and then our Mishnah could discuss its machlokes. The reason why we're talking about 2 gaps is because in the case of a house you need 2 gaps. Why? Because the house has the halacha of pi tikra, has the halacha of the ceiling that serves to close off one of the gaps. The Gemara says, hold on a second. First of all, Shmuel doesn't hold a pi tikra. And second of all, if the ceiling closes off a gap, it should close off both. What does it help that that you have 2 gaps? Now, where do we see that Shmuel doesn't hold a pi tikra discussion about an achsadra, a roofed pavilion that has no walls out in the field. Rav had said that the roof counts as 4 walls, and Shmuel said it doesn't count as 4 walls. So the Gemara says, no, Shmuel really holds a Piturka just when you plan to use the ceiling for all 4 walls, that Shmuel doesn't hold it. But if you're using it for only 3, that's okay. So the Gemara says, well, that's the answer to your question here. This is a case where you need 4 walls. Because you're missing 2 walls, you need 4 walls to be formed by the ceiling. How so? Again, you're missing the corner. And each piece of wall that's missing is also missing a couple of tfachim of roof there. That means that the roof ends up being jagged, almost like a staircase lying sideways. It's missing a strip on one corner, and it's missing a strip on the other corner, forming 4 edges of roof. The 2 edges meeting in the corner, that's now deeper in, and the tefach, the edge that's running along the tefach gap from where the walls used to be to where the roof now is. So that's 4 walls there. That's 4 walls that have to be created by the edge of the roof. You do not allow 4 walls to be created by the edge of the roof. And that's why Shmuel says, in a case like this, that could be a valid explanation for our Mishnah. Mishnah is talking about where the corner is missing, therefore you have 4 walls that need to be created by the Pi Tikra, and that's why the Mishnah says it's considered to be Asr. If you had only 1, you would have Pi Tikra and you wouldn't have a problem. So now the says, well, why doesn't Rav say like Shmuel? Why doesn't Shmuel say like Rav? So Shmuel doesn't want to say like Rav because Rav has to say that we're talking about a slanted roof. Slanted roofs were rare in the days of Chazal. You can't just stick that into a Mishnah if it doesn't say it. Rav didn't want to say like Shmuel because Rav holds that even if you need 4 walls created by a Pi Tikra, you can. The ceiling can provide 4 walls for you, just like he says in the case of the Achsadra, the pavilion out in Rishus Harabim. Now the Gemara adds something to the case of the Achsadra, the pavilion with no walls. There we had said that Rav said that the roof forms all 4 walls, and Shmuel says that you can't form all 4 walls with a roof. Gemara has 2 versions as to how big the gaps and the walls that need to be formed here are. According to the first version, the only machlekes is if the gaps are larger than 10 amos. That's where they argue whether or not Pi Tikra could do it. But if it's less than 10 amos, everybody agrees the roof can form that wall. According to the other version, it's the other way around. If it's more than 10 amos, there's no machlokes. Everybody agrees that it cannot form it. Machlokes is when it's less than 10 amos, do we say it can form it by the ceiling?
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.